Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the final proposal for the Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review Initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our presenter, Kevin Head, as well as Katie Wickler, Jenny Sage, Guillermo Bautista Alberte, Gabe Murtaugh, and Sydney Mannheim. The presentation for today's call is available on the initiative webpage on the California ISO website. Today's call is being recorded, and the video file will be available for a limited time on the ISO website. This recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be taking questions throughout the call today. If you have a question, you can enter the question queue at any time by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. I'd just like to remind everyone to please start by introducing yourself before asking your question. This slide here shows where we are in the policy initiative stakeholder process. We are here at the final proposal. We plan to present at the EIM governing body on November 4th, and then the ISO Board of Governors November 18th, 19th. So for today's call, we're going to start with an introduction by Kevin, and then go into stakeholder comments and changes made from the draft final to the final proposal. And then I'll wrap up today's call with some next steps. So with that, I will hand it over to Kevin Head.
Thanks, Isabella. My name is Kevin Head. I'm a market engineering specialist here at the California ISO, and I'll be talking through the presentation today. Today's presentation will focus mainly on the changes that we made between the draft final proposal and the final proposal, so it'll be pretty brief. And so I'll start with just a brief intro on what the VOM Cost Review Initiative is. It proposes to change how O&M costs are estimated and accounted for in the ISO markets, and it does so in three main ways. It proposes explicit principles to use to categorize O&M costs. It updates the cost framework on which the proposed principles will apply, and it updates the default values for the O&M adders that can be used instead of going through the negotiated process. The next slide shows briefly, the stakeholder comments that we got on the draft final proposal were broadly supportive, but we did have some requests for changes and clarifications. So we made changes to the final proposal in response to some of these, but not for others, and I'll go into the rationale for why that is. So starting with the stakeholder comments, just going in alphabetical order, I'll run through all of them and then open the call up after we've been through all of them. So the first set of comments were from Alliance Energy Marketing, and they expressed concerns about a certain clause that we had in the variable maintenance principle, saying that variable maintenance costs are expected to be incurred within the service life of a resource. And their concern was that in assessing the service life of the resource, it may require the ISO to subjectively estimate a retirement date and results in the costs not being included. And the rationale for this is, if there's an estimated retirement date and then the applied for maintenance activities are estimated to occur after that retirement date, those costs would not be included. And Alliance Energy Marketing's concern was that scheduling coordinators and resource owners have a lot more information about the timing, both the timing of the maintenance activities and their expectation of when the resource will retire. And so in response to that, we agree with them that we do not have all of the resources information that we could use to derive our own assessment of when the resource will retire and when they will perform the maintenance activities included in their application. But the CAISO believes that we still have an obligation to ensure the sufficiency and accuracy of the information that underlies the negotiation. So in cases where there's a little bit of uncertainty about the date of retirement compared to the date of when the maintenance activity will be performed. The ISO will ask for the scheduling coordinator to support their request with some sort of documentary evidence. We won't assess how well that evidence supports the SC's claim, but rather whether or not it supports their claim. So, if they submit an explanation of the fact that they're expecting the resource to retire in some distant future date because of some long-term agreement they've signed or that type of thing, that would sufficiently support their claim that they'll perform the maintenance activity before it retires. If instead they submit a recipe for chicken noodle soup, we probably won't accept it. So that's the distinction there, and that's the change that we made between the draft final proposal and the final proposal. We also note that any wear and tear on the resource that won't be repaired is not a variable maintenance cost. So it's just one clarification in the paper. Moving on to APS's comments. They had requested whether we plan to automatically escalate the cost estimates on an annual basis. So I'll split this into two components. First is whether or not we'll automatically escalate negotiated values, and the answer to that is no. Negotiations occur on a number of different bases. Sometimes they're based on quotes from vendors that are escalated using one inflation methodology. Sometimes they are estimated, the maintenance applications are based on PPAs or long-term service agreements, which may have their own internal inflation methodology. So applying a single inflation adjustment to all these might not be appropriate. I would note that we do receive a number of inflation adjustment negotiations for existing major maintenance adder applications, and that these negotiations are often pretty brief. They take place at a resource-specific basis, but they're relatively brief and simple. Considering the automatic adjustments to the default values, we are not planning on doing this on an annual basis, but inflation is one of the factors that we will consider during our triennial, once every 3-year reviews of the default values. So we're not committing to doing an inflation adjustment at this time, but we will certainly consider the fact that costs increase over time during the triennial reviews. Moving on to PG&E's concerns, they had two concerns. The first concern was about the timeline of the initiative. If you'll remember in the appendix, we lay out a timeline for how we intend to phase out or phase the negotiations for adders under the new framework. And that timeline was meant to be illustrative. We don't normally commit to a timeline in the policy process because there's a number of intermediate steps. The biggest one is that it needs to be approved by the Board of Governors and FERC. But we do think it's worthwhile to message a target go-live date, and that target go-live date was originally October 1st, 2021, when the new default values would go into place. In response to PG&E's comments, we think it's reasonable to move that date on which the default values would go live back to January 1st, 2022, so just a shift of the timeline by 3 months. And the next concern was based on PPA-based applications, and in particular, in situations where the resource owner and the scheduling coordinator are two different parties, and the PPA is the only source of information that is submitted by the scheduling coordinator. So in these types of situations, we typically ask for the underlying maintenance cost information, and if the scheduling coordinator is unable to supply that, we suggest that the default O&M adders are the best option for these cases. That's one of the main reasons why we are doing this initiative, is to address situations like this where for whatever reason, there's a constraint on the information that can be provided to the ISO. So that's why we have these default O&M adders that are now including some major maintenance costs. And the reason why we have to ask for further information and dig a little bit deeper is we have an obligation to ensure the sufficiency and accuracy of the negotiated values. So that's our plan for PPA-based applications. Moving on to Puget Sound Energy's comments. They left a number of really thoughtful and detailed comments, so thank you for those. I'm not going to go into the details of all of them this morning, but I did want to highlight two. The first was their suggestion that non-betterment replacements of major components should be considered variable maintenance costs. And when I'm referring to non-betterment replacements of major components, I'm referring to, replacing an entire turbine or replacing an entire generator. In these cases, we believe that the situation is more akin to creating a new resource rather than maintaining an existing resource. So we don't believe that these are maintenance costs. So that's why we include that language in the principle for variable maintenance costs. The second point is their suggestion that we propose default values for technologies at a more granular level. So, for example, instead of having one default value that applies to all hydro resources, we would consider default values for small hydro versus large hydro, or different classes of combustion turbines, E-class versus B-class, et cetera. And the rationale for why we didn't propose them at this more granular level is based on a constraint on information. If you remember, our estimation methodology for these default values required both an external estimate and a cross-validation against an existing pool of major maintenance adder applications. And for these more granular levels, we do not have a sufficient number of major maintenance adder applications that are at that more granular level. So we don't have a sufficient number of applications for small hydro resources, so we can't further disaggregate the estimates. That said, going forward, we expect to have more negotiations because of new EIM entities joining our markets, as well as just ongoing negotiations. So if we gather more resource-specific information and cost estimates, then we would consider proposing default values for these more granular level of technology. So those are the comments that I wanted to go over today. And I'd like to open the call up now to talk about any of these comments and our response to them, as well as any other general comments to the initiative.
So as a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Michelle, will you let us know if anybody enters the queue?
Absolutely. There's currently nobody in the queue, but I remind ladies and gentlemen, #2 will enter you into the queue. All right, there's currently nobody in the question queue.
Okay. And we'll move on to the stakeholder timeline. We're currently in the process of drafting the tariff and developing the BRS. And then, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we are planning to present at the EIM governing body on November 4th, and then at the Board of Governors on November 18th and 19th. We are accepting written comments on the final proposal. You can submit those through November 12th, and you can submit those through the comment template, which is available on the Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review Initiative webpage. So the template is available. You can go in and submit comments anytime between now and November 12th. So we'll open it up for any last questions before we conclude. Michelle, will you let us know if there's any questions?
Absolutely. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, pressing pound 2 on your telephone keypad will enter you into the question or comment queue. All right. I do not see any questions in the question or comment queue.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Okay, well then that concludes today's stakeholder call. Thank you all very much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.